it was a magical moment. Again, they were still young enough to be able to really nail those songs. And Jimmy's playing was fantastic, and he still had that energy. I remember when they came on to do the encore, it was the song Rock and Roll. And Jimmy did that kind of guitar rock god leap at one point during Rock and Roll. And I felt like I was watching The Song Remains the Same, that the clock had turned back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We're getting off the Bruce Springsteen train today, but he will come up as he usually does. We're going to talk Jimmy Page, music, podcasting, writing. I have Christy Hallberg on the podcast. We've connected. We've already spent 10-15 minutes solving the world's problems before we hit record. I think this is going to be a lovely conversation. Christy, welcome to the show.
Well, I thank you, and I think the world is going to be a better place after
yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah. So tell us a little about yourself.
Okay, I'm the author of the novel Searching for Jimmy Page, which is going to be a year old, October the 20th, 2021. I'm not sure when this episode will go live. But I'm also the host of a new podcast called Rock is Lit, which is all about rock novels, and it's from Pantheon Podcast Network. And I'm a teaching professor of English at East Carolina University and senior associate editor of North Carolina Literary Review. What else? I've written a lot of short fiction, creative nonfiction, book reviews, interviews, that sort of thing that have been published in a bunch of literary journals through the years. And a lot of what I write, including obviously my novel, has a rock music theme. So I've always enjoyed kind of joining those two passions.
Good. I'm looking forward to dwelling into a little bit of all of that. So you're in South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. Okay. So you're kind of in the South too. I'm here in Texas, though. I never think of Texas as being South.
Yeah,
right?
I think of it as the West.
Yes. Same thing. When I lived in Louisiana, I never, I always think of Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia as the South, and Louisiana is just this weirdness that's separate. But yeah. So I read some of the reviews, and they talked about a new voice in Southern literature. That had to make you perk up and go, really? Wow, that's a nice compliment.
It certainly did. That was wonderful.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about it. I always like to start at the beginning. Tell me where you grew up and what kind of music did your family listen to as you grew up?
I was born and raised in Greenville, North Carolina.
Okay.
And I live now on the other side of the state, near Asheville, in the western part of the state. But in terms of music, when I was growing up, my dad was primarily into classical and big band and orchestral music. And my parents divorced when I was 7. So I was less influenced by his musical taste than, say, my older siblings. And my mom really wasn't all that into music. She liked movie musicals. And I got a little of that rubbed off on me. I used to want to be Judy Garland when I was a little girl. My siblings are considerably older than I have one brother who's, I think, 13 and a half years, maybe 14 years older. My sister is 12 years older. And then another brother's 10 years older. So the brother that's 14 years older liked nothing but the Carpenters. He just really dug the Carpenters. So I remember as a little girl singing those songs and hearing those songs and just loving Karen Carpenter's voice. And she had one of the purest voices in rock and roll, if you want to call that rock and roll. And then my sister, Martha, was really into country rock, like the Eagles and the Marshall Tucker Band. But the sibling that was the most influential was the next to the youngest, my brother Steve. He was a drummer in various rock bands around town, and I thought he was really cool. And he idolized John Bonham, Led Zeppelin's drummer. So I got Led Zeppelin from him. I got the Stones, Jimi Hendrix, the James Gang, Janis Joplin, all of that classic rock and harder rock I got from him. And that wound up sticking to my bones, probably a little more than some of the other folks in my family, some of their inspirations.
Christy, that's a common theme here. In fact, I was talking to someone today about that. I kind of see it all as I'm talking to people, that there'll be daughters really influenced by their dad's love of music, and there'll be sons really influenced by their mother's love of music. But siblings come up a lot here, where either you're the oldest and you're influencing your younger siblings, either to the and I don't mean positive and negative as good or bad, but either they embrace the music you're doing or they rebel against the oldest music and, kind of find their own way. Like, oh, you love classic rock, I'm going to love grunge, you love hip hop, I'm going to find country. But there is several people like yourself that had an older sibling who were that huge influence. And I've said this many times, I always think of Almost Famous, that early scene where she gives him all the albums, and you see Pet Sounds, and she's like,
light a candle and listen
to this
Tommy.
in the dark. Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, that's very similar to what happened to me, I think. And I also, from that same brother, got blues. I fell in love with Robert Johnson and all of these great blues musicians, and much older rock and rollers, the ones from the 50s. So I got quite an education growing up that was pretty varied.
So once you reached high school, what did you find your own musical taste? Did you go through a rebellious phase?
Well, I'm going to back up a little bit and go back
Please.
to junior high. So I was thinking about my Bruce Springsteen connection as I was getting geared up to be on this podcast. And I realized that my interest in him, or my knowledge of him, was sort of tangential and began when I was in junior high.
Okay.
So I used to like to watch Guiding Light after I got home from school.
Okay. This is the first. I've not heard of Guiding Light before. So yay, I love this.
Well, I can't believe nobody has talked to you about Guiding Light, because in the 80s, I think this was, 1984, maybe.
Okay.
There was this one character, his name was Lou Jack, that he was trying to be a music star. And so on the soap opera, they actually did a music video, and he was singing Springsteen's song Out in the Street. Only I didn't know it was Springsteen's song. So I thought, I kind of, like that song. The video is really hokey, but I like the song. But that was really the first time that I remember finding out about Bruce Springsteen, and it came from Guiding Light. And you could still see that stupid video on YouTube to this day. And it's really horrible. And then another junior high memory that involves Bruce, I loved the movie, and it was from 1983, Eddie and the Cruisers. And so John Cafferty and the Beaver Brown Band did the soundtrack to that. And I remember my brother listening to that going, that band sounds a lot like Bruce Springsteen in the E Street Band. So you see, I'm just kind of slowly migrating in that direction.
Yes.
Through all of these little road stops along the way, these kind of strange things. But then Born in the USA came out when I was in junior high too. So I'm still in junior high. And I have to admit, I did not like that album. I did not like that song. And I know that it's this really defiant song about a Vietnam War vet who returns home to crappy circumstances and few options. But it so quickly got co-opted by a certain segment of the population who apparently they only listened to the refrain and didn't hear the verses and what the real story is. And so I just began to associate it with that. And it didn't appeal to me. And it took a while. It really took until I got to college before I heard the album Born to Run and gained respect for Springsteen as an artist and really began to like him. So that was kind of my start with Bruce Springsteen. But no, when I was in high school, I was mainly into the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, the Stones, the Who, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, classic rock. That was my jam in high school.
So you mentioned you've listened to a couple episodes, which that's very kind of you to
Yeah.
say. I don't know if you've gone back and listened to Yushan.
No.
Yeah. So back in April of 2021, I had a writer, Yishan Lee, who was talked about she's Taiwanese, and she has mixed emotions about Born in the USA. And the reason why, in a little bit of spoiler, it's a great episode. And she ended up also doing on the Music Talks podcast that I talk a lot about Terry Smith,
Mm-hmm.
where um, when they were at like Cub Scouts or family camping, some kind of thing, that people were running around their tents singing Born in the USA, kind of mocking them because they weren't. And
Yeah.
so she says it's almost like that. I'm at a Springsteen concert. Yeah, yeah. Oh, Born in the USA, gotta sit.
That's
Yay.
great.
So yeah, it is. I do think it's funny that a few years ago, at the end of the previous administration, when he was in the hospital, that people were blaring "Born in the USA" as one of the songs, and you're like, did you not listen to the
I
song?
know. I
You
know.
know, and it goes back to Bruce saying, I don't think Ronald Reagan's favorite album is Nebraska. So
Right.
yeah, that is neat. Um, so Bruce was in your orbit, but
Right.
never caught on for you, right? That he wasn't someone that spoke to you in any way.
At that point, later
Okay.
on, yes.
Oh,
Later on,
talk to me a
yes.
little about that.
Well, I love Born to Run. I love that album. There are other records that I like too. And, it's just funny when I got into Bob Dylan in high, it was either late junior high or early high school. And I just went crazy for him. And that led me to artists like Springsteen.
Yeah.
And, so I love the album Darkness on the Edge of Town. I mean, those songs, Badlands, The Promised Land,
Mm-hmm.
the song Darkness on the Edge of Town, those spoke to me. I was a little bit of a melancholy kid. And then, talking about the album Born to Run, the song is just so electrified, and it's so full of energy and hope and movement. So that spoke to me as well. And gosh, Thunder Road, Jungle Land. And then The River came out in 1980. So I was 10. So at that point, I was not aware of Bruce, but I do remember hearing on the radio Hungry Heart.
Sure.
And I remember liking that song without knowing who was doing it. And I love the song The River. So, I was aware of him, or aware of his music more than
Right.
him. And then around when I was in college, that's when he became one of the artists that I really respected and liked.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
If you would, who do you say is your go-to artist, or is there one? Do you have a handful of people, musicians that kind of speak to you, that you go to the well over and over again with?
Well, the obvious answer for me would be Led Zeppelin.
Yes.
I've been a fan since I was 15 years old. As I say, my brother idolized John Bonham, and I discovered them one day when I came home from church with my mother.
Yeah.
And this was 1985. I was 15. And Steve was sprawled out on the couch watching the concert movie, The Song Remains the Same, the Led Zeppelin concert movie on MTV. I think it was the first time MTV had broadcast that. And I remember hearing a note or two of music as I walked into the house, thinking, I recognize that, and following the sound into the living room and seeing Jimmy Page on the screen. And they filmed that concert footage at Madison Square Garden in 1973. The movie didn't actually come out until 76. But so there's this young, 29-year-old Jimmy Page, and he was freaking beautiful. And he was a monster musician. He had the whole package. And for a kid like me at that age, who was a little bit dark and who was interested in all kinds of things, maybe outside the realm of what was socially acceptable in a small southern town in 1985. It was like the Messiah had arrived. He was so interesting, and the music was so fascinating and brilliant and dark and light. So there was this magical quality about the band, and especially him, that caught me from the get-go, and that has become part of my soul. They're always going to be my A number one.
So how have you been able, and I always preface this, whether I'm talking about Bruce or any other thing, that the amount of times you've seen an artist perform live is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are. Like, I can remember I had a similar experience, and I've shared this multiple times on the podcast. Summer of '77, I'm in a Montgomery Ward's, because that's how I hung on a Saturday night. And I picked up, there was a Beach Boy 8-track, Endless Summer, that was on sale. And I didn't know who the Beach Boys were, but the album looked interesting, the cover, the 8-track cover, and I plugged it in my 8-track player, and I'd never heard harmonies like that before.
Oh, yeah.
And I just became, because at the time I was listening to a lot of Kiss and AM Top 40, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness. And I didn't see the Beach Boys till like 81, 82.
Okay.
And I thought I would never see them again, right? They're past their prime. No one is buying their new albums, even though I am. I'm buying Beach Boys, Beach Boys Love You and 15 Big Ones and all these albums that weren't commercially successful. So how about you, Led Zeppelin? Have you been able to see parts of the band? What? And I am a Led Zeppelin novice.
Okay.
Do not know hardly anything about them. And my
I've got you in my hands now.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, they broke up in 1980 when I was
Right.
10, so I never got to see the band in its original form. When Robert Plant was on tour for his album called Now and Zen in 1988, and I was 18 years old, I got to see him a couple of times. And this was the first tour as a solo artist that he was playing Zeppelin songs on it. He had not done that prior to that. I mean, he may have worked in one or two, but on this tour, it was a ton of Zeppelin. So it was such a wonderful experience for me to see him. And he was still there, he was still young. He was late 30s, early 40s, something like that. So those two shows in Chapel Hill and Charlotte, North Carolina mean a lot to me. And in the mid 90s, he teamed up with Jimmy Page for an MTV Unplugged special that they called Unleaded. And an album came out of that, and a tour. I didn't see them on that tour, but they toured again. They came out with a new studio album of original songs in 1998 and toured for that. And I did get to see the two of them in 1998 at Virginia Beach. I was in the nosebleed section, but it was a magical moment. Again, they were still young enough to be able to really nail those songs. And Jimmy's playing was fantastic, and he still had that energy. I remember when they came on to do the encore, it was the song Rock and Roll, and Jimmy did that kind of guitar rock god leap at one point during Rock and Roll, and I felt like I was watching The Song Remains the Same, that the clock had turned back. So that is an experience that I will never forget. But other than seeing them on TV before and since those experiences, I've not been able to catch them.
So I'm going to use this as a transition. Have you seen Bruce perform live?
No, I haven't. I would love to.
Okay. So I was thinking you might say, well, I had tickets, but then he canceled his North Carolina stop, back in 2016. So I didn't know if that maybe was the case.
I know exactly why he canceled that tour too.
Yeah.
And that was quite something.
Yeah. God. Sure. What I'm curious, because from our perspective, I ended up having a roundtable with it, and most of us fans, supported that. We thought it was good of him doing that.
Yeah.
We were empathetic to, if you're a Springsteen fan and you have nothing to do with that law, you're like, okay, this sucks. So I take it you were living in North Carolina at the
Oh
time.
yeah. Oh
How
yeah.
did it get covered? I'm curious.
It was covered a lot
I imagine.
nationwide. It was
Yeah.
we're talking about the so-called bathroom bill.
Yes.
And the state was trying to implement this law that said that you can only use the restroom. The people is dependent on the sex that's on your birth certificate.
Right.
And so this was, we all felt this was discriminated against trans people. And it wasn't just Springsteen. Everybody was canceling concerts. Everybody was canceling all kinds of
Sporting
events.
events and everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were businesses that industries that planned to come into the state that said, no, we'll go someplace else. So it was a big brouhaha. And I was really glad. I wasn't surprised that he canceled, but
Yeah.
I was really glad that he did.
That's neat. Well, he's touring again, so maybe you got a chance. So let's switch over for a minute. I want to talk specifically your novel, but before that, did you always have that need to write in you as you started growing up?
Yeah. I can remember, I started keeping a diary when I was 7, and it was one of those little deals with the lock on it, and you have the little key, and of course you've got nothing of interest to write in it. But
yeah,
I remember starting to keep a diary then, and that progressed to writing short stories and poetry. And then that progressed to journaling, which was, a more creative way of getting your thoughts down, and you're expressing, having a creative outlet. And I remember as a child staying in from recess to write little short stories. So it's always been important to me, but I've always said that music is the first art form that grabbed me. And it's the one that has, I think, the biggest hold on me. But the two fit together so well in my life, in not just what I write, but now this podcast has come about that marries the two art forms. And so writing is something that has always been in my life.
So one of the things you talked about, and as I said, I had a conversation recently with another guest that music did not lead me to necessarily other musicians. Like I never had that, so I like I like the Queen, so I should look at this, or other things. But writing did that to me.
Okay.
If I like Isaac Asimov, I should check Arthur Clarke or Ray Bradbury, or someone writes in this book and mentions in the foreword or the afterword, I really enjoyed this book. Oh, well, then I should go. I was doing that way before Amazon said, if you like this, you will want this. But it sounds like music did work that way for you, correct? That
It did.
Liking Led Zeppelin led to maybe I should look at blues, which should lead me to, other soul music and stuff. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it also led me to Joni Mitchell.
Yeah.
Jimmy Page and Robert Plant loved Joni Mitchell, and I had never heard of her as a 15-year-old.
Right.
But the notorious book Hammer of the Gods came out. I think it was that year. And so it was before the internet, so you couldn't just look up your favorite artist and learn all about them. You had to go read a book or a magazine or something.
Yeah.
And it was through reading that book that I learned a little bit about their musical proclivities, what they liked. And oh my goodness, it's quite varied. They like all this stuff that you wouldn't necessarily initially think they would. So I got to Joni Mitchell through Led Zeppelin. And it's just kind of worked that way with a lot of artists that I've been interested in. I was talking about really loving Bob Dylan earlier, and that kind of segued into Bruce Springsteen and other artists like Nick Drake, for instance. So there are a lot of artists I got to because of other artists.
So let's talk about the book.
Okay.
You said you had written other articles, you had done reviews. So talk to me, where did you started thinking about maybe I want to write a novel? So share me through that.
Wow, this book is so long in the making. Of course, I shouldn't say every, I'll just speak for myself. I always knew ultimately I wanted to write a novel.
Okay.
Um, but it seems so daunting. And
Yes.
what do you, I mean, it's one thing to write a short story, and that's hard enough, but how do you sustain a plot line and these characters, make these characters interesting to last for 300 pages? So as a young person, that felt almost impossible. I kept trying. I would start and maybe get 50 pages into something, and I just couldn't finish it. And what I now at 52, almost 53, realize is that what I unfortunately for me, I mean, some people can crank out something brilliant when they're 20 years old. For me, there was a lot of living that I needed to do. I needed to experience some things. And unfortunately, it took the death of my mother, whom I was extremely close to. And I took her death very hard. And then years later, about 10, 11 years later, I lost my husband too. So they both died of cancer. And that kind of loss changed me in a lot of ways. And one of the things I did to try and crawl out of the bell jar after my mother died was take this trip to England. I'd never been out of the country before. I didn't have a passport. I had to go get one. But I heard that Jimmy Page and Brian May from Queen and Dan Hawkins of The Darkness were judging a guitar contest for charity in London, the summer of 2005. And I thought, well, that's it. I've got to go. And in my mind, it all made sense. It was like, if you can go, if you can make this journey, and you have to make it alone. It was like my vision quest. If you can make this journey and somehow make contact with this person who connects you to your mother and your brother and is such a big part of your life, if you can just kind of make contact in some non-icky way, then maybe you'll have the strength to come back home and get your life together. And so that's what I did. I went off to England, and I got a ticket before I left to attend this contest, and it was at the Hammersmith Palais in London. And I did have the opportunity to say a few words to Jimmy. And I mean, there were several chances that came up that night, and I was so starstruck that I couldn't say anything. And so finally, when he was leaving, that was my chance. And you'd have to know me. I'm a pretty sedate person, not at all a groupie type.
Yes.
But when I realized, oh, he's leaving, and I've come all this way, and I'll never be in this moment again. I'll never have this chance again. So you'd better step out of character and do something. So I just started chasing him down the hall at the Hammersmith Palais. And I caught up with him at the stairway, of all places. And he had a bodyguard in front of him and a bodyguard behind him. And they're at the top of the stairs. And I'm assuming they're going down to a car park. And I screamed. The only thing that came to mind was, Jimmy, I've come all the way from America just to meet you. And then that, that was it. That was all I could think of to say. And he stopped and he looked at me, and I'll never forget it, because he had the kindest eyes. And he looked at me, and I said it again. And the bodyguard behind him kind of tapped him like, we got to get going here. And Jimmy looked at me and he smiled and he said, "I'm sorry." And he left. And I thought, well, that didn't go the way I thought it would. At the same time, I thought, I've still had that moment. I still had that interaction. So, damn it, that counts. You made the trip, you made the journey. That's what matters. Now get your ass back home and get yourself together.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And so that's when the story that eventually became the novel began to really take root, because it started out as a memoir. And I started working on that memoir after my husband died. And it kind of centered around that trip, that 2005 trip to England. And I finished it. And then I realized that's not the book that it needs to be. It really was a therapy tool. So then I realized, no, this needs to be a novel. And so I went back to the drawing board with that experience kind of at the center of everything and totally reshaped it. So it's about 15, 16, 17 years in the making.
It appears, I looked on your website, looks like you've gotten a lot of critical acclaim on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, it's done pretty well. And the audiobook is getting ready to come out in, I don't know, a month or so.
Okay.
So we're just continuing to roll along.
Yeah. Tell my audience a little bit about the book.
Sure. Set primarily in the winter of 1988, the story follows 18-year-old protagonist Luna Kane as she travels from her family's farm in eastern North Carolina to London to search for. She's trying to solve the mystery that her free-spirited deceased mother kind of set in motion when Luna was a child. Is Jimmy Page her father?
Oh, okay.
So that's the situation. And so the first half of the book takes place in eastern North Carolina, where I'm from. And in that respect, it's sort of a Southern lit kind of book. There's a lot of the sort of Flannery O'Connor Southern Gothic in it. She has a great grandfather who actually has the same name as my great grandfather, whom I never met. He died decades before I was born, but he's sort of become this mythological figure in my mind, because he actually, my great grandfather, just like the character in the book, tried to heal his wife of breast cancer through faith healing. So he was this really interesting kind of character. So there are elements of that kind of Southern Gothic in the first half of the book, but the second half is Luna in the UK. And she visits a ton of Led Zeppelin related sites. And they're all places that I've been. I've made that pilgrimage 4 times now. So I've gone to all those places, and not all of them made it into the novel, but every single place where she goes does. So that, it's literary fiction. It's the subgenre would probably be rock novels, which is what my podcast focuses on.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I got into that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is definitely a rock novel and literary fiction with Southern fiction thrown in.
Well, I can't wait to read it. It sounds amazing.
Thank you.
I have had the rock and roll librarian on my podcast. So we
Christian.
had a lovely time. We talked about the Bruce's autobiography, and we covered that. So tell me how you got in the podcast business.
Well, it kind of starts with the rock and roll librarian. Did you have Christian and Shelley on, or
I
just
had
one
Shelley?
of them? Okay, you had Shelley on. Okay, yeah. So they did an episode of Rock and Roll Librarian on searching for Jimmy Page.
Okay.
And I actually had never heard of the Pantheon Podcast Network. And unbeknownst to me, I wound up being a guest on a whole bunch of their shows when I was promoting the novel.
Sure.
Mostly last year, or late last year, early 2022. And at one point, I thought I was querying Carmine Appice, who had a show on that network, and I was trying to get on his podcast, and unwittingly, I sent it to the email address that belongs to the COO of Pantheon, and he wrote back and said, "Yeah, I noticed you've been on a bunch of our shows. Do you have an idea for your own podcast?" And I had never thought of that. That was no. I did think about it and realized, there's a whole world of rock novels out there that a lot of people don't know about. And I'm talking good stuff, literary stuff. Like Jennifer Egan won the Pulitzer Prize for her rock novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad. And I could go on. I mean, there's so many really good books that are rock novels. And I said, well, what do you think of this? And Peter and Christian Swain, who is the other half of Rock and Roll Librarian, and is he's either the COO or the CEO. I forget which role he plays there, but I got with Peter and Christian, and we kind of developed this show, and we aired the first couple of episodes September the 15th, I think. So I'm getting ready to drop the 7th episode very soon, and it's just kind of taking off. It's doing pretty well.
What kind of books have you covered? What books have you covered? I know what type, but what books have you covered?
The first person I had on was Jeff Jackson, who wrote a novel called Destroy All Monsters, the last rock novel. And
Okay.
it was very important to me that he be the first guest because he's the one who introduced me to this whole subgenre. He's a North Carolina writer. He lives in Charlotte, and he has a band, a punk band called Julian Calendar. And I interviewed him for North Carolina Literary Review, 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And the journal asked me to review his book, and I read it and loved it and said, I really want to talk to him. So I got in touch with him and we met and we did the interview, and he just opened up this whole new world to me. And he told me about all of these novels. So, and we become friends. And so he was the first guest. I did the second episode on Susie Quattro. She wrote a rock novel called The Hurricane, and some other books. Let's see. Dana Spiotta is going to be in an upcoming episode. Her book, Eat the Document, was a National Book Award nominated rock novel. Zachary Lazar's novel Sway is fantastic. Janet Fitch, who's best known for White Oleander, which was made into a movie with Michelle Pfeiffer, also wrote a rock novel called Painted Black, and she was on a recent episode. So I've had some incredible people on so far.
That sounds great. So I take it you get the author to join you. It isn't just like a book club. You have the writer on to discuss the podcast. Very cool. It seems fun.
Well, I do that. That's the main part of the shows. The author's on and I interview the author. And then the last segment, I'll have a music expert on to give some real world context to whatever artist or musical period or musical issue comes up in that fictional setting. And that I think adds this little spark to the episode. It kind of takes it to a different level. And that's been so much fun. I mean, I just interviewed Danny Goldberg, who was former president of Atlantic Records and Nirvana's manager. And he also did PR for Led Zeppelin and was vice president of their record label Swan Song in the 70s. And I just did an interview with him, which was a lot of fun. So there've been so many amazing people who've been on so far.
Is there anyone you're chasing that you would love to get?
I want to get Jennifer Egan, who wrote that Pulitzer Prize winning A Visit from the Goon Squad. Haven't made contact yet, but fingers crossed.
Okay. That sounds great.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. So what's next for you, Christy? Are you working on another novel?
Oh, kind of, sort of. The podcast is taking all my time right now, and I'm also teaching full time.
Okay.
So I'm trying to carve out time to write, but it's been hard.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to music a little bit. What are you currently listening to? What is on your MP3 player, your iPhone?
Well, so because I'm reading nothing right now except rock novels, whatever music is in the book that I'm currently reading is what I tend to listen to just kind of immerse myself in it.
Okay.
So say like with Janet Fitch's novel, Painted Black, that had a lot to do with very early 80s LA punk. So bands like the Germs, the Weirdos, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I listened to a lot of that. Let's see, what else? Okay, when I read Zachary Lazar's novel Sway, that novel brings together the Rolling Stones and Charles Manson's family and the films of Kenneth Anger. So I already loved the Rolling Stones, but that was all I listened to for a week or so when I was working on that one.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Chris Charlesworth, who's a legendary music journalist, and he wrote a novel about Elvis. So I also was listening to a lot of Elvis, and that was timely because then I went to see the movie that has just come out.
What was that book?
It's called Caught in a Trap, The Kidnapping of Elvis.
Oh.
It's about a fictional kidnapping plot of Elvis.
Okay. That sounds great.
It was interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And who's that written by?
Chris Charlesworth.
Chris Charlesworth. All right. Mm-hmm. I'll have to check that out. Cool. All right. So, anything I should have asked you that I haven't? Is there a story in your backpack that I have not asked? And after we go like, oh, darn, I should have told you the time that Jimmy Page sent me a letter saying, "Hey, I love the book."
That has not happened.
Okay.
I have no idea if he even knows about the book.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
no, I can't think of anything.
Yeah. I have the same. People are like, "Oh, do you think Bruce knows about your podcast?" No. Bruce has no idea my podcast. Maybe
Maybe.
someone in the grander thing of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's good. All right. All right. Uh, tell people what's the best way to find the book, and what's the best way to check out the podcast.
Okay, you can find the book. I think the best way to do all of that is just to go to my website, because you can access all of that stuff there. It's
Okay.
ChristyAlexanderHallberg.com. And I mean, you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. And the book you can find, I always try and steer people towards their local indie bookstore. If you
Absolutely.
can't do that, there's always Amazon. You could order
Yes.
through Amazon. There are lots of links on my website for lots of choices on my website for outlets where you can order.
Very nice. I am hoping that maybe in 2023 you can see Bruce and you can join me back
All
and
right.
talk about that. That would be fun.
Yes.
I end every podcast. If you are a fan of Christie's, and you're listening to this podcast first, thank you. She did you proud. I end every podcast with the Mary question. So
Mm-hmm.
what that is Jay Armstrong, who just recently has a new memoir out, bedtime stories for adults, bedtime stories for the living. He said he was an honors English teacher, and he would spend 2 days breaking apart Thunder Road, looking at all the lyrics, talk about the themes, basically treating it as a poem. And
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the 2 days, he would ask the question, does Mary get in the car?
Mm-hmm.
So, Christy, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
I absolutely love that question. As an English teacher, I love it. And this kind of reminds me that the situation of does she get in the car reminds me of the Joyce Carol Oates short story, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Which is about this kind of creepy guy trying to convince this young girl to come out of her house and get in his car. And he actually does convince her to do that, but we don't know what happens to her after that. And you kind of presume it's not going to be a positive outcome. So I'm sort of flashing on that when I listen to Thunder Road now and get to the end. I mean, does he actually? Because the narrative voice in that song is not creepy.
Right.
It's a very different vibe. It's actually very hopeful, and I like to think that she does. I like to think that she does decide to throw caution to the wind, and he's sold her on the idea of taking that leap of faith and going out there and seeing what the world has to offer. And I think that's really the heart of what that song is about. I mean, it's about what's out there for you. It's hopeful. So it doesn't seem likely to me that she wouldn't, given that kind of theme that's gone throughout the whole song. So I'm going to vote with yes, she gets in the car.
I love that answer. By the way, I now want to check out that short story.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Now, I always thought of the Lady or the Tiger, right? Because I remember that from early, when I was in high school, and
Yeah.
the whole idea, I wanted to know the answer, and my teacher's trying to explain you that is the answer. You have to choose.
Yeah.
No. I want to know what the real answer is. And
That's the beauty of art.
yes, it is the
To
very
figure it
beauty of
out.
art. So I absolutely love that. Awesome. Are you on any social media? I
I'm
know you've got
everywhere.
you're on your everywhere. All right, good.
Yeah, I'm Twitter, Instagram at Christy Hallberg, Facebook at Christy Alexander Hallberg. I have a YouTube channel,
Okay.
and then there's the website.
All right. Very nice. Well, this was so lovely. I had a
Yes, it
blast
was.
talking to you. I hope you had fun.
Me too.
I will, after I read the book, I may have to come have you back on, and I can just fawn over how much, because I know I'm going to love it. I know it's just going to be a
I
great
hope
book.
so.
Yeah. All right, listeners. Thank you for listening. Go out there, get vaccinated. Go be kind to each other. I just signed up for my latest booster. I've got that coming up on Friday. So get out there, be kind to each other, and that's how we're going to survive this. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, listeners. We'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. This podcast is made possible because of my wonderful patrons. I want to thank Randy Brown, Rob Barnett, Crystal Strong, Bella Pori, John Munson, Betsy Hodges, Levi Petrie, Stephen Malio, Steve Rogers, Dale Hozak, Terry Smith, Anna Lynn, Chris Bloom, and Mary Thomas. I appreciate all of y'all kicking in your hard-won cash to help me spread the good news of Bruce Springsteen's music. I love y'all. Okay. I'll get something to drink. I made a note. Cancel, edit out the call.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I will probably end up cutting this out, but I got a chance to meet Bruce at a book signing.
Ooh.
He was in Austin. I ended up driving to Austin and standing in line, and I make the joke, but it's not a joke. In my mind and out loud, practice what was I going to say? What was I going to say? And if you've ever watched The Godfather, where
yes.
Luki Brothka is outside talking, thinking of what he's going to tell the Don, that was me, right? And
may their first child be a masculine child.
Exactly, right. And so I'm sitting there. We finally get there. They had a box where you could put any gifts, and I had a letter with a MP3 of some of my shows and said, this isn't songs, this is just, I've done this. And I did wear a Set Lusting Bruce t-shirt. I didn't tell him about it, but I said, Bruce, last year I spent 9 months unemployed. I listened to Better Days and Land of Hope and Dreams every day to keep my spirits up. Thank you for that. And then about halfway through it, next, so they're pulling. So I got my picture with them, and I've said multiple times, I don't know if he heard me, but I needed to say it more than I needed him to hear it.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I get that. And that moment counts to me. It was So I like yours, him saying, I'm sorry, I've got to go. Would have been worse. Well, why didn't you come up earlier? Right? Like, because I was afraid, Jimmy.
Right.
You're Jimmy effing Page. So that's awesome.
Well, that's a great story that you have, a great memory that you have.
Yes. Yeah, it really was. So